Welcome to the Untangling Web3 podcast. DeFi generated over $700 million in revenue last year, but most of that value never reached the users powering the ecosystem. In this episode, we're exploring a bold new approach to rewriting that story. Katana, a DeFi optimized blockchain incubated by Polygon Labs and GSR that's designed to return value to users and unify fragmented liquidity. Joining us are two leaders behind this vision: Marc Boiron, CEO of Polygon Labs, and one of the sharpest minds in crypto infrastructure and regulation, and Simran Singh, head of DeFi Trading at GSR, a firm at the heart of institutional crypto markets. Together, we'll be unpacking how Katana could power the next wave of consumer and institutional finance and what it means for the future of DeFi. Marc, Simran, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jack. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you guys for joining. This is a very exciting episode. We've covered Polygon a couple of times in the past, and I think this is going to be a really, really interesting new dimension to what you guys do. So yeah, maybe before we start, could you, because I know we're talking to, Marc from Polygon, Simran from GSR, can you maybe explain just a little bit about yourselves and background and where this kind of collaboration is coming from, like why are we all in the room together today?
Sure. Sim, you want to go for it first?
Sure, yeah. So Simran Singh, heading up our DeFi trading team here at GSR. And I would say there's a myriad of reasons why I think this collaboration and co-incubation made sense. The Polygon team has shown itself to be strong partners and DeFi native in the truest sense of the word. And I think this collaboration allows us to showcase that in a very apparent and obvious way.
Yeah, and I'm Marc Boiron, and I'm the CEO at Polygon Labs, also contributing to Katana. And yeah, from our perspective, we're very big believers in like DeFi centric chains and really purpose-built chains in general. And when you're talking about DeFi, like I think having a team like GSR in your corner who has significant expertise in trading, including like on-chain trading, I think it makes a huge difference whenever you're talking about like liquidity, which we'll learn is like a cornerstone of Katana and how we think about things.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you guys. I really appreciate that. So yeah, I think maybe to start with, I'd like to just set the scene a bit as well for our listeners in particular. So obviously you guys are now obviously building something quite special in the DeFi space. People might ask, okay, what's wrong with the DeFi space at the minute? What are the kind of the challenges? And you hinted at liquidity there. I'm sure that'll be kind of part of it. But yeah, maybe if we start with you, Marc, like if you could just kind of give an overview and snapshot of the DeFi ecosystem we have today at large and kind of what the kind of core issues are there.
Yeah, sure. This is one I'm pretty passionate about, so happy to be talking about it. So, look, if you look at DeFi as it is today, it's way off of what people care about in finance. And as much as DeFi is different from TradFi, the reality is people want the same thing, right? When you're on the institutional side of things, you want really deep liquidity so you can trade in size and borrow, lend in size. When you're on the retail side, you just want higher yields, right? And you want to be able to earn those. And when you look at what DeFi looks like today, it's really not great for that, right? Yields look high because of massive token emissions that like disappear eventually. But like fair enough, like you can get pretty high yields in DeFi as a result of that. It's just not sustainable. But then also when we look at the liquidity side of things, really, this is probably where I think DeFi is weakest in general. The way DeFi is built today, it would be like saying that Binance is going to create an order book for like every region around the world and not aggregate them or not care to aggregate them. It would be like saying they want multiple exchanges in the same country and go to that different exchange. It doesn't really make sense. And to be specific about what that looks like today, it doesn't matter what chain you're talking about. You can be talking about a chain like Polygon POS or Arbitrum or Solana or Ethereum, or you could be talking about something that's supposed to be DeFi centric, right? Like Vchain and Sonic and Unichain and Mantle. They all have the exact same problem, which is that they have at least 30 DEXs. They probably have at least 10 lending protocols. And what happens is that you get one of them that emerges and is pretty big. It ends up being like 50, 60% of the market share. But what happens is that and by the way, that's not even all of them. Lots of them that's actually split much more equally than that.
Sure. Yeah.
And what ends up happening is that you get $100 million of TVL in one, you get $100 million TVL in the other, and then you get $50 million of TVL in the other. That's $250 million of TVL, which is really not bad. But when you split it across 3 different venues, well, the most TVL you have in any one of them is 100 million. Which is really not much. And then when you dig into pools, it becomes equally bad, because what will happen is you'll have 5 different versions of a BTC wrapped BTC. And you end up trading with like at most like $5 million of liquidity on like a wrapped BTC pool. That doesn't like really make sense at all. And anyone who understands like finance and what people want, look at that and say, this is not ideal. And so Katana is really intended to fix this by actually concentrating liquidity in one venue of each type and with limited assets of like the same type. And then similarly providing like yield that is actually like real, i.e. it is sustainable and will continue to exist for, frankly, forever.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think in terms of just not only just when people look at the ecosystem and think, okay, this is complex as well, and there's so many different actors, you have to think about risk across all of these different places and venues at which you have this liquidity fragmented, right? I imagine lots of the additional risks that your TradFi world would be looking at would then come into play there. I mean, Simran, I know that GSR is so heavily crypto focused, but from your worldview, does that kind of square as well with kind of what TradFi is thinking about in relation to DeFi, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I would say when it comes to institutional adoption and capital, right? People have been clamoring for, oh, the institutions will come, the institutions will come. Well, they're never going to come if you don't actually give them sufficient liquidity, right? Which is the lifeblood of any ecosystem. And I think the paradigm shift that we're kind of seeing here with Katana is, instead of having a bunch of core apps, we're having a actual set of core apps that are meant to collaborate and have synergies with each other. And the concept of chain-owned liquidity, which I think Katana is presenting quite well, to incentivize these protocols to work together and actually reward native users in the most organic way possible, is kind of what's critical and underlies the organic adoption of Katana as a whole. But yeah, I think institutions will naturally see the cost benefit analysis and see the upside of saying, hey, instead of trying to engage with fragmented liquidity across dozens of protocols, across dozens of chains, the promise of crypto was meant to be, I can own my value and own my assets in a way that allows me to get the biggest bang for my buck. And I can do that on this one chain, which is supposed to be the one-stop shop.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And you can immediately see how much more tangible and appealing that might be as a value proposition to a kind of financial institution, right? I can 100% understand that. So yeah, why don't we get into a little bit more about Katana? So we've kind of covered the core of like what the problem is at the core that you're trying to solve, but can you kind of give us a brief overview of what exactly is it at its core, and how does it work? And also maybe how does it compare to other, because lots of people talk about aggregation and liquidity fragmentation. We talked about it with a few different guests before. So how does it compare to kind of the existing offerings out there?
Sure, I can jump into that, and so maybe I'll pass off how it compares to other offerings out there. But yeah, so we talked about this idea of like really focusing on deep liquidity and on high yields. And by the way, I talked about this from like a what does typical finance want. We also did this survey in like the crypto space. We went and surveyed a bunch of folks and said, hey, what are the things that you care about? And like number 1 and 2 were deeper liquidity, higher yields. Number 3 was security. And so security to me is like the baseline thing. And we went and focused on the 2 things that people really, really care about. Now, how does that show up in Katana? First of all, like there's a lot of cool things about Katana. So you hear people talking about things like Vault Bridge and like the flywheel and chain-owned liquidity. And these are all things that we should talk about, and I think they're important. But the really big strategic difference that makes Katana like actually a different approach from others is this idea of like core apps, and specifically doing it in a permissionless way. So right at the core of Katana is really like 3 DeFi protocols, and that'll probably expand to either 4 or 5 eventually, where the goal is to only have like one of each type. So specifically, like there will be one lending protocol, which is Morpho. There will be one spot DEX, which is Sushi. There'll be one perp DEX, which is Vertex. Eventually, what we'll want, actually most likely, is like a yield protocol specifically that does benefit from its own like liquidity and depth of liquidity there. And then the other one that ends up being surprising to people is like a meme coin type launchpad. And the reason for that simply is actually somewhat liquidity fragmentation across the bonding curve, but also like attention fragmentation. If you have two different meme coin launchpads and people 50% is going to one and 50% is going to the other, the likelihood of any token graduating and actually going to momentum goes down significantly. And so you actually do want like concentration there. So at the core, you get these protocols. So now when you think of it and you think of like all the liquidity that can come into a lending protocol, it's coming to one place. It's coming to Morpho. Same thing on the trading side, right? Coming into like one of those venues. One of the side like ancillary benefits of this is actually simplicity. I've seen this over the last 2 weeks since we kind of like announced the existence of Katana publicly, is people saying, oh, this will be nice. This is actually just easy. I don't need to think about where I'm going to go. Like I know where I'm going to go. And that is part of like the intention. So we start off with this idea of concentrating liquidity in these core apps. So then the question becomes like, how do you actually achieve that? And that's where a lot of like cool mechanisms that we talk about come into play. But at the core, what you want to do is do this in a permissionless way so that you can get thousands of apps built on top of these core applications and like thousands built around them, none of them competing. So how do you prevent that competition? First of all, you admit that you're an opinionated chain that doesn't want the competition, and you reject all competition and tell them not to come. It's really like that simple. But then step number 2 is where you really think about like yield and incentives. And this is why people shouldn't come if they want to try to compete with them, because there'll be too many incentives that are going to flow into these protocols. And specifically, we think of it as like 5 sources of yield. One of them is CAT, which is like the Katana token. That is one source of yield. We can put that in like the emissions category that like most protocols have and show high yields. Second one is the core apps actually giving their own tokens. That is something that is also going to incentivize just these core applications and these like core assets. Put that again in like the emission side of things. Then we get into like, let's call it the real yield side of things. So all deposits of USDC, USDT, ETH, and BTC into the chain are actually deposited to Morpho vaults on Ethereum. And those assets get lent out, they earn yield. That yield goes right into those core kind of applications. Similarly, for all sequencer fees that are generated, all of that goes right into these core applications. There's going to be a set of users, mostly institutions, who are going to say, I don't want to take like bridge risk in any way whatsoever. And so we have a native stablecoin, which is Agora's stablecoin, AUSD, where a majority of that yield goes right back into the core applications as well. And so basically what you have is tens of millions, eventually hundreds of millions of dollars going straight into these core applications. Now, of course, by the way, this is not just benefit them. All the apps that build on top of them, it flows right through to like those apps and their users, right? And so you can really see like that there's just going to be like more yield there, and that yield's going to grow, right? As more deposits come in, that's more yield being generated, so it's sustainable. As there's more activity, that's more yield generated from the sequencer fees. And so you end up with in the world where it actually becomes kind of sustainable. That's like really like the core of it. Sim, maybe I could pass it to you to talk about like some of the cool mechanics around like the flywheel and kind of chain on liquidity and stuff like that end up kind of bolstering it even further.
Just to hammer in the point, I think for me the core crux is this: being opinionated and being discriminatory in your tastes. I think is what's going to serve Katana quite well. And that is really, as I was saying earlier, the paradigm shift that I'm a big fan of, right? In a world where you can do anything but not everything, what you choose to do matters. And simply having these core apps that can build in a permissionless way, but then also know that, hey, like my competition is not necessarily that there's going to be 27 copy pastas of me. It's going to be, hey, I am the core app of this particular chain, and it is my duty and obligation to continue to advance in that regards. And in terms of the mechanisms that Marc was mentioning, and this kind of flows in well with the chain on liquidity, by reallocating sequencer fees and by reallocating the yield that's being generated, whether it's through CAD emissions, whether it's through native token emissions, I think one, we can actually reward users and actual LPers, right? For too often, you see this element of incentivization where there's mercenary capital that will come in and park assets there. But now we're beginning to see this element of like, well, okay, instead of just having short-term liquidity deals where the liquidity is there and they're simply yield farming for short periods of time and then leaving accordingly, the goal is to incentivize more long-term behavior, and that's through I think allowing these synergies to take effect, but then also rerouting chain-owned liquidity, whether it's in the form of sequencer fees or any sort of emissions, back to the native depositors and LPers over a longer time horizon, I would say.
Yeah, this is a very, very interesting approach, right? So it sounds to me like you're almost. I love this opinionated aspect because it's kind of like, yeah, we're happy to kind of be the kingmakers of DeFi in the future, from what I'm hearing, right? If we're going to build this ecosystem, we deciding on which are the kind of core apps that we're using in each department, one of each type. That does make sense, right? Instead of having, as you say, hundreds of copycats everywhere that do the same thing, that fragment liquidity, you can spin a new one up if you want, pretty much instantly. And then that also reduces confusion, I imagine, as well, right? Especially from the kind of retail side, so you don't end up kind of stepping on each other's toes in that way.
One, I think is important is doing the same thing with assets. So where we talked about it from a protocol perspective, I think that's really important. We think about it very similarly from an assets perspective. So like you will see like Lombards, like LBTC as like the liquid staked Bitcoin in the ecosystem. We also don't think that you need 10 different versions of liquid staked Bitcoin, right? Like if you actually just concentrate all the liquidity in one of them, the question you have to ask yourself is like, is there a material difference? We do need, like, for example, I wouldn't want just like a liquid stake Bitcoin. I would also want a liquid stake Bitcoin and like a naked wrapped Bitcoin, right? Like you would want both of those because they're actually materially different assets. And so if you end up doing that, like what ends up happening is you do reduce distribution, right? And this is one of the themes on Katana is actually like TVL numbers on Katana will not look like TVL numbers on other chains. Like the numbers will be smaller. But when you actually look at like fees that apps generate, fees that the chain generates, I think you'll actually see that it's going to be much higher, notwithstanding the smaller TVL, because this TVL is actually going to be productive, which is something that we can talk about that I think is really important. But on this asset side of things, it's the same thing, right? They don't have distribution. But the thing is, there's ways to deal with that, right? There's no reason that shouldn't, if those assets are truly like materially the same, there's no reason that somebody shouldn't be able to bring any version of like liquid stake Bitcoin, deposit it, have it immediately swapped through whatever we want to do. It won't be liquidity pools on Katana, it'll be elsewhere. And you're actually depositing the version like the Lombards.
Today's episode is sponsored by the Vchain Foundation.
Now, we often talk about how emerging technologies like blockchain have the potential to revolutionize sustainability. And Vchain is at the forefront of this green movement with initiatives like vBetterDAO. Let's take a closer look.
Imagine tracking small actions like recycling at low cost, making them valuable assets. These verified records build a massive collective impact, benefiting people through their own actions. Sound a bit complex, but Vchain made it fun. Explore our apps at vbetter.com.
Vchain's goal is to power a new era of sustainable solutions. So if you've got an app idea or just want to earn rewards for small, sustainable actions every day, go check out vbetterdao.com to find out more. And now, back to the show.
Yeah, I think that makes, again, a lot of sense in terms of almost having like a gold standard for each, not just protocol, but also like asset or instance of an asset, right? Instead of having many of the same thing, it makes sense to kind of choose one. I'm curious, kind of what kind of goes into the decision-making process or the criteria that you use when you're selecting these core apps or this specific version of a given asset, like you mentioned, different ways to wrap BTC, for example. So what kind of thought process goes into how you are selecting those?
I mean, from my side, I would say just like the history of the team itself. I mean, like Sushi is one of the OGs of all OGs when it comes to DEX liquidity and MM liquidity. The Lombard team, I think, has shown itself to have built a really good product and gained significant traction. And then, I think having strong teams with actual like organic development and motivations and have built a track record of building really good products and saying, hey, let's give you a platform to take what you've done, which is already phenomenal, and bring it to the next level in a very concerted effort, but still in a permissionless way is what I would say is one of the key things that we've used to evaluate.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's important. I also think like when you think of like the importance of what they're going to do, security probably is like the most crucial. So like if you actually look at like who you'll see there, right? Like from more of a super simple code base. It's something that like you just compare like the lines of code on Morpho with others, and it's like very easy to audit. You can get very comfortable with Sushi, like very long history of like good security approach over there. Same thing with like Vertex. You look at like the core assets, like so you look at like Lombard and Ether5, for example, like very good history there. So that's definitely one of them. A second one of them is like distribution. Right. So you think about it from like the Morpho side, like they generally, I think of it as like distribution comes through curators, right? And they have like lots of very high quality curators. I mean, every major curator is like curating on Morpho and helps bring TVL over there along with them themselves. Think Sushi. I don't know if I'm free to say what like their active monthly users are, but it's like actually enormous. People think of like Sushi as like, hey, something that was like in the past. I think a lot of it has to do with like the focus on like aggregation across chains, which ends up being actually very useful for Katana as well. But like the distribution to a lot of users ends up being meaningful. So that distribution point is like a second one that I think ends up being like very, very relevant. And then like, I think like the third point ends up being like, this is like Sim touched on this, but just like quality of the team and just their ability to execute. So yeah, those are like the most important things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's kind of refreshing to see a little bit of a mix of approaches in there as well. Like it's the kind of trust on the human level and the security level, and also the traction. So it's kind of, it sounds like you're kind of getting a best of multiple worlds there. I'm also kind of curious about, so I'm thinking of like, I don't want to say minimum because it doesn't sound very minimal at all, but I was thinking like, you're almost building like a minimum viable ecosystem, right? That has everything in it, that has one of each type, for example, protocol, asset, that can work, right? So like, as you said, you remove that kind of bridging risk for institutions. So they don't need to bridge between chains to go and do something. They can do everything in this kind of one-stop shop. So again, I'm sure you maybe have an opinionated answer on this, but are you kind of, is this a play to become the de facto ecosystem, or how do you see this kind of working alongside other ecosystems of DeFi? Or maybe, I mean, now that I'm saying out loud, I'm kind of thinking there doesn't exist such an ecosystem like this, right? Because it's still fragmented. But I'm curious what your kind of take is on that.
Yeah, so I think, I think the minimum viable kind of concept is actually not a bad one. Like I think there's going to be a lot there that like the normal idea of like minimum viable product does not really apply, but there are things that we definitely do think about this, which is like, what can you bring to users so they don't need to leave to go to another chain? And one example of this that we haven't talked about is Universal. So Universal is a protocol that basically can wrap any asset that is available on like Coinbase custody and available. They're kind of like called U assets. So what you'll see on Katana is actually very intentionally a lot of like U assets. So USOL, UXRP, USUI, UAptos. Like you're going to see these assets that are here not because like we think that people should trade more, SUI on Katana than on SUI. Maybe that ends up happening. Maybe there's higher yields there in the end, but it's actually more that users who do want exposure to SUI don't need to leave Katana to do that. And so that is like very intentional. It's like this comprehensive ecosystem where you can get a little bit of everything. But I also just don't believe that like there's going to be like one chain that can handle all of finance in like decentralized finance on like one chain. Like it's just not like viable on any chain. And so do I think Katana has a chance to be the biggest one simply because when you actually have higher real yields and you have deeper liquidity that people want to be there? Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And they don't have a reason to leave to go elsewhere. So I do think it can become the biggest DeFi ecosystem in crypto, but I definitely don't think it'll be the only one. I think like what I envision, I think this will happen across the entire space, is that as we evolve, just fast forward like a few years, what you'll get is you'll have somebody who niches down a little bit more into something specific in DeFi that ends up being interesting. And, like I actually vision like protocols on Katana that become successful and that like leave and become app chains on their own. We kind of like skipped this in DeFi, where like we went from like general purpose chains to like app chains. Whereas like somebody like gaming did a much better job of going from like general purpose chains to like gaming specific chains to like game specific chains. And so to me, like DeFi has started realizing this in the last 6 months with new protocols coming up. Is like, hey, let's build something. Let's go from general purpose to actually like DeFi specific. But then you're going to have like app specific chains for like when apps get big enough. So yeah, I think there's going to be room for everything. There's also interesting things like, right, like Vchain, like super cool approach to how they're doing things. I think there's like some downsides to it. I think there's the fragmentation issues that we talked about, but like there's going to be like a unique set of users because they have a unique culture there that is like fun, like that are going to want to like be on Vchain. So like I don't view it as like killing all DeFi, but I do hope that Katana will become the biggest DeFi ecosystem in all of crypto.
I would also just add that, like, I think saying anything is a killer is typically very like myopic in general. The number of times I've heard the phrase "ETH killer" or "X killer" is more than I can count on all my fingers and toes. That said, like, I think competition ends up being quite healthy and useful for innovation, right? Like, even if we can maybe not minimum viable product, but if we can build like a medium viable product, then I think it kind of changes the paradigm a little bit more and kind of helps people realize the need for something like this when they weren't consciously thinking about it, and just allows for true organic native adoption, right? That's always the name of the game. I think you can always get short-term spikes and things, but it's like what thing's going to be around for the next 5 years, 10 years? That's kind of the name of the game in this context.
Sure, that makes complete sense. And I completely agree with your sentiment that anything that attaches killer to it is more likely to be killed in the short term, or if they do, it's going to be a very slow death for whoever they're killing. You also kind of made me think there, as you both were talking, it sounds almost like you're one way to kind of, as a metaphor to think about this, is you're kind of creating a bit of a university for things, right, as well, so that they can, it's a test bed, they have everything there they need as a protocol or a token, for example, and then they can graduate to become their own app chain, for example, in the future. That's one way of rationalizing it all in my head, I think.
No, I was going to say that's actually a good way of explaining it. I think that the reason why, so one thing that we're doing that unique to Katana that I think of this way is like, so a lot of ecosystems have like tons of apps that are like specific to that ecosystem, right? Like they're like named after that ecosystem. Yeah. I've actually literally told every app not to do that. I actually think it's a very bad approach. And the reason is because it massively limits your distribution. Right? If you think about it, you have a good protocol that gets built and they're growing well. If they were to go to another chain and users were to come to the interface and be able to select what chain they were on, that is just more potential users who can see that the Katana product is just better. Right. So like, this is not saying I want users to just go to other chains. This is saying I actually think Katana will be a better product. And if you increase distribution by offering that brand on any chain, that what will happen is those users will over time say, I want to go to the ecosystem that actually offers like the best product, right? And so that's one way of like being like very like open for apps. It gives them a lot of freedom that like a lot of other ecosystems try to like restrict them on. And similarly, and this is why I was kind of leading with this, it's the same idea, which is like allowing them to graduate, right? If you actually think about it, like having an app that is so successful on Katana that it takes up all of the block space and creates a bottleneck for other apps is not actually a good thing. I mean, it is good, right? Like you want that app, but like if you actually carry that out for like long enough, like it's not, you would want that app to actually go create its own chain. And then what you would want to do is actually have amazing cross-chain infrastructure that allows for those cross-chain transactions, which is like where like the Polygon side comes in very importantly, again, with like the ag layer, which is cross-chain infrastructure that is intended to allow that app chain to interact very seamlessly, eventually in milliseconds with that app chain, so that app chain can interact with the rest of the Katana ecosystem. Now the Katana ecosystem gets its own block space, doesn't have to worry about that one successful app, and that one successful app can be successful over there. And that kind of like interaction ends up being like a much better user experience, which is the thing that matters.
Yeah, I really like the way you've kind of framed that as a very concrete use case for that almost graduation mechanism whereby if something becomes so popular with so much utility, it makes sense for both parties for that to kind of graduate to an app chain, right? Because, just purely on a demand and traction perspective, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think we've covered the core, I hope, of Katana quite well here. I'd also like to know a bit about the almost the origin story. Like, how did this come together? And maybe to you, Simran, like, what's the role that GSR is playing here, and how how has it gone from maybe an idea in your guys' heads between you to where you are today?
I was gonna say, I'll defer to Marc on the OG story of Katana. I think the part where GSR has been a little bit more active is really appreciating the amount of dedication and focus the team has had to building very interesting and actually usable and tangible products in the DeFi space, and then leveraging obviously our more than 10-year history in crypto as market makers to say, hey, these are kind of core partnerships that we think you should develop. And then how obviously opining on design choices, right? When it comes to like in a world where you can do anything but not everything, maybe this is the native version of BTC that you want, or maybe these are the actual core protocols that you want to go with, and this is the cost benefit of analysis, and kind of sharing our, I would say, market experience and expertise in helping guide those decisions. But yeah, we'll defer to Marc on the OG story of Katana and maybe how it got its name.
Yeah, like a lot of it actually. So it started first from a Polygon centric perspective of like building out the ag layer and saying, hey, we know chains don't want to build their own DeFi ecosystems because they're gaming chains, they're deep end chains, whatever it ends up being. Like they don't want to have to spend that money or get that expertise or take up that block space. And so creating a chain that has really deep liquidity on the ag layer was really important. And so when we started thinking about that, what it turned into was something bigger, which was like, okay, I think we can create that, but we can also create a chain that like independently just has massive value. It ends up creating tons of value on the ag layer, but then independently also has a lot of value. And when we started thinking about that, a lot of it was like, you know what, like it's really hard to compete in DeFi right now. Like there's a lot of chains that do it well. And so from my perspective, like don't try to attack like incumbents with the same strategy. And so really what I was thinking was, okay, how do we actually approach this in a way that is strategically different from others? And when you start thinking about that, you just kind of like walk through different ideas in your head and you kind of land on this idea of like, well, why don't we not fragment liquidity? And why don't we actually just pick a set of winners at the base layer? And what you start realizing is like, oh, maybe there's actually a chance here to do something different. And when you start playing it in your head, you start reaching the thing of like, oh, this is actually what users have been telling us that they want. and you start like just building all of that out and realizing, okay, this is actually the DeFi ecosystem that should have existed that never did because of just the nature of general purpose chains, like, and the whole concept of like being credibly neutral. And like we did it all on POS, right? Like we on Polygon POS, like we know that. So that was a lot of it. And then really again, like you understand the liquidity needs and you think of like who's out there in the market who can help bolster that in a way that is like additive rather than extractive. And I think like bringing on GSR and then co-launching this together allows them to have like really the approach of like a founder on this rather than like a kind of like external partner that allows for like a very like value additive approach to this. And I think GSR's like mentality is that in the first place. And so like bringing them in that way, I think makes it so that like Katana ends up being really well positioned to not just like conceptually be good, but actually like lean into like both of the kind of founding team strengths to bring it together.
Awesome. Sounds like a match made in heaven. So yeah, I'm very kind of, I'm very excited to see this in the wild because again, I as you described, I don't think I've seen anything quite like this in terms of building that whole medium or much better than medium viable ecosystem for what the world needs, not just for the institutions, but again, retail and people who want to use it every day. Like, as you said, interviewing the actual, surveying the actual people on the ground who are using this, the DeFi natives. I 100% agree. I don't think they've had anything like this to play with before. So on that point, where are we now? Because we're very recent, right? This is very new as far as I'm concerned. I know time scales are shortened in the Web3 world, but can you just talk a little bit about where you are in the roadmap and kind of what people can expect going forward in terms of when they can expect to be using it themselves?
Yeah, but I think pre-deposit campaign's been live for a few weeks now. I think end of May, and I believe public mainnet is announced for end of June. Marc, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what we have slated. So yeah, I encourage everyone to deposit as soon as possible, either through the native Katana webpage or through the Turtle Club LP campaign, and you can choose what kind of yield you want, and it's very well established. And then once public mainnet hits, I think we're off to the races by the end of the month.
Yeah, I think the cool thing on public mainnet will be just given these pre-deposits, it'll be like having an ecosystem that you can come into from day one and actually start interacting, both in terms of like the liquidity being there, but also I think we'll have a solid set of like 30-ish applications that'll be launching like within the first couple weeks, which will give people things to do, very much with a focus on like bringing quality applications that'll be like fun to interact with, rather than just like let's overload as many applications as possible into this ecosystem and tell everyone there's a bunch. So I think that'll be unique. And then like one thing is we'll kind of launch with a little bit of a unique approach. So most chains just have this bridge, and then you go to like applications to do what you want. Katana will be a little unique in the sense that it'll have a bridge, but there'll actually be like a default kind of like application that you can come interact, very opinionated again as a chain. Those two things will actually start separate, and then within like the first few weeks, we'll actually like bring them together into like one integrated interface where you can like bridge and then go use any app that you want, or you can actually just directly deposit into like vaults and start immediately. I mean, the whole thesis behind Katana, when you actually play all of this out through like the liquidity and the yield and like what's incentivized, is you actually realize that like the incentive here is actually for like productive TVL, not just like linked TVL. Like the way you actually earn yield in Katana is using applications. You can think back at like other apps like Blast, for example. You could bridge on Blast and sit there and hold your asset, do nothing, and earn yield. Katana doesn't work that way. You actually need to do something. So the productivity of assets and like users there is going to be significantly higher than you'll see elsewhere. And like being able to do that from like day one ends up being like really important. So I think that'll be something that'll be like unique and interesting on Katana.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to stress actually, is that difference between, you know, having composability in DeFi for the sake of composability and some of the kind of non-optimal incentives that can bring, compared with something like this where you have that kind of incentive, you have the flywheel of the ecosystem itself that kind of self-reinforces. That makes a lot of sense. So I think, guys, we've done a great job, I think, of summarizing some very technical concepts and also the problem at heart that Katana is solving. So I really appreciate that. I just want to kind of close things off with maybe let's take a breather and, you know, a bit more blue sky. I want to ask you both, is there anything outside of, I mean, in your case, it's outside of DeFi, right? So it's taking you to the edges, but outside of maybe directly what you're building with Katana, is there anything in Web3 that particularly excites you in terms of, you know, use cases or, you know, anything more esoteric that maybe people wouldn't be thinking about right now?
I would say the themes that I find are taking a lot of momentum is probably the RWA narrative. I think partnering with dexes that are helping people trade these products, whether it's gold, oil, or any FX currency in a 24/7 market, is certainly an interesting paradigm, and I think that's going to be what helps bridge people from TradFi and crypto native worlds, right? Like everyone wants to be able to get a lot of excess leverage. That tends to be a more crypto native element, but then being able to trade these real world assets is more of an institutional playbook. And so I think bridging both of those worlds in a thoughtful way is super important. Then I think there's a lot of work being done in terms of on-chain derivative settlement and management networks. And what I mean by that is in typical traditional finance, right? You presume, let's say it takes 2 weeks for you to close out a counterparty, or when you're issuing margin calls or any of these complicated things that we take for granted in TradFi. I think bringing a lot of that on chain will drastically increase capital efficiency and allow people to get a lot more flexibility for the assets that they hold on balance sheet. And like one reason I say that to the core is the promise of crypto for me, when I put on my macro turban, is very much so that crypto should allow people to leverage their value and own their assets in whatever way possible and abstract away all of the tech-specific elements of it, right? If I want to pay for my cup of coffee, overpriced coffee with Apple Pay or crypto, it should be a very seamless process. If I want to take into account my actual credit score, I should be able to bring that on-chain and engage with RWA elements of that. So I think the advancements being made specifically in these areas are just some of the things that excite me a fair bit.
Yeah, and I'm like super biased towards things we're building at Polygon, so I can't help myself. But like, look, cross-chain infrastructure still sucks, like period. And so the ag layer is something like we spend all our time on at Polygon and care about a lot in terms of actually creating like a secure, fast, cheap, like cross-chain experience that like users appreciate. So that I think is exciting because like honestly, like I think we've got a lot of things that are good, like interim products, like I think like solvers are great, like interim products and like necessary right now. I think like bridges that exist can create like good experiences right now. But like when you think of like something that can like underpin Web3, right? You do need something that's actually scalable. It's fast, it's cheap, but it's also secure. And so that's I think like a kind of like boring but exciting thing that I think we're building at Polygon. And like when it comes to actually like areas like we've been spending a lot of time on Polygon POS on like the RWA and payment side. And so kind of similar to what Sim said in terms of like a lot of cool things that are going on there, but like the growth on the payment side is just absolutely insane. And like seeing like basically every fintech is like interested in stablecoins right now. Like the amount of growth that we're going to see there is super cool. And to me, that's like one of the things that's exciting about that is actually how it feeds into Katana. Because with great cross-chain infrastructure between like Polygon POS and Katana, then you can drive a lot of like payments use cases on POS, and those people can then leverage Katana yields whenever they really want, and like the depth of liquidity. And so kind of ends up being very symbiotic. So those are some of the things that I think are cool in the space right now.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that the whole narrative emerging around institutions and stablecoins is pretty mind-blowing, to be honest. And you can't really get away from it at the minute. And on one hand, it seems a little bit dry, but to actually see the space being taken so seriously for such an important use case, I think is really good. So yeah, and I hope everything you're building with Katana can only help kind of contribute more to this trend, this upward trend we're seeing in the last couple of years. But yeah, Marc, Simran, it's been a huge pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much. I hope we'll speak again in the future. If anyone wants to learn more about Katana, then just check out the links in the description. And yeah, all that remains to say is thank you for listening, and you can join us next time to untangle a little more Web3.